We really should pay more attention to video game music. It's something that I'm guilty of since I rarely make videos that put music as the focus, but it's honestly a fascinating subject if you dig deep enough. Especially when you throw in a little bit of added context to spice things up, because there have been a lot of games made in the past where the soundtrack has been a bit far removed from the overall quality of the game. Not that long ago I made a video about the worst games for music, which included a couple of halfway decent video games, so it's only natural to turn the tables a bit and talk about the opposite. A game so bad that its music stands out very nicely indeed. Work that one out if you can. It's not even that strange an occurrence either. Game music is typically worked on away from the rest of the game's development, and so if the main frigate is on fire and rapidly sinking, you can always rely on a little rowboat sneaking away with some hope for the future, and usually some pretty awe-inspiring music. It's a little inspiring that way, since it suggests that you can always find some good inside absolute dumpster fires, and that music will rarely, if ever, let you down. That's an important lesson to learn at the best of times, and if it takes some bad experiences with undercooked video games to teach you that, then that's fine with me. Maybe I'll be teaching it to you today. It's actually quite difficult for a video game soundtrack to be terrible, since music comes in so many different genres and styles, and all it has to do is match the game that it comes from. I suppose if you think on that too much, you could argue that a great soundtrack being associated with a crappy video game doesn't really go, but you know, it's better than the alternative. I'll always stand up for music, even in difficult circumstances. I mean, someone has to, and I don't exactly have much else to do at the moment. Scoring for older games was a hell of an adventure. Considering the incredible resources we have nowadays, with AAA games having entire orchestras on tap to help bring a soundtrack to life, it is remarkable how far composing music for video games has come. Back in the 80s, and for most of the 90s as well, video game music was limited to whatever tones were being generated by the game's sound chip, often leading to that iconically sexy chiptune that we've all heard of. Simplistic technology gave rise to simplistic music though, and stripped melodies back to their bare essentials, which just helped make them all the more catchy to listen to. So there's this fun trend of older games being shaky from a game design point of view, but capable of spitting out some spectacularly catchy theme music. Even Konami were getting in on it. The 80s was probably Konami's best decade. Obviously no competition compared to nowadays, but if you look for a list of some of the games they released in that time, so many of them hold up really well and ended up having very successful franchises built off of them. Chief amongst which would have to be Castlevania, which is ball-bustingly hard at most points, but is a good example of a game that has lived on through many decades of scrutiny. I wish I could say the same about the sequel. I have a hard time with most of Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. There's a bunch of cool ideas here, like the game's non-linearity and an attempt to introduce RPG elements into the series, but the day-night cycle, while a neat addition, ends up bungled due to it needing an awkwardly long loading screen to transition between the two. Not a terrible game, but definitely one that tries to do too much too soon and struggles to take the series forward in any meaningful way. I say that, but Castlevania 2 is home to like the Castlevania song, and it's kind of amazing that Bloody Tears of all things is to be found in such a below average video game. You know, Bloody Tears, the fan favourite piece of music that has been remixed and reworked into every other Castlevania game after this because it's just that good. Yeah, apparently Kenichi Matsubara didn't get the memo that Castlevania 2 is a slow-burning grind fest when he started making one of the most energetic pieces of video game music out there. I like a lot of this soundtrack really, it's just that Bloody Tears is so much better than the game it comes from. 1987 is a hell of a time to set a precedent like this. I suppose that's something you can always fall back on if things start going wrong. What are the chances though? Yeah, but Castlevania 2 isn't that bad, is it? It's a little annoying and suffers a lot from the kind of archaic game design that we left behind many horrible nights ago, but I think it's a fair reflection of what games could be at the time. Besides, it's Konami, you'd hope that they could piece together a banging soundtrack considering the groundwork is so strong from the first game. Cheetamen isn't blessed with similar levels of fortune, although maybe there were plans to give it equatable focus from its developers. Despite being linked to the ill-fated Action 52, Cheetamen was intended to be the marquee release among that crapsack. One of the sole reasons that you'd make that big purchase, since the allure of these iconic characters is just too much. Didn't get too far off the ground though, because much like the rest of Action 52, Cheetamen is a buggy monstrosity that fails to feel like anything other than a lethargic slog through crappy game design. This doesn't count as its own game though, since it's just one part of a much larger package, but hey, that's what sequels are for! I mean, they had to be for something, right? Cheetamen 2 is like most modern sequels in the way that it's very similar to the first game, but the similarities fizzle out when you find out that Cheetamen 2 was never finished or officially released and required some patches done by fans in order to function properly. It's to be expected, since both entries into the Cheetamen mega hit series are so broken that there's hardly a decent bit of platforming joy to be had anywhere. So it's surprising when you hear the main theme and it's this good, and I honestly can't even begin to explain why. To suggest that Cheetamen 1 and 2 have great soundtracks would indicate that someone with talent had a part to play in bringing these games to life, and all I can get from the internet is that it was probably Mario Gonzalez, who also did some of the design work for the game and is currently working for indie dev CNG Studios. So, turns out that some good came out of this terrible corner of gaming history after all. But fuck, didn't expect it to slap so hard. The combination of a bad game having great music is both a rare occurrence and not that difficult to do at all. It depends a lot on how the production played out and how detached the composer was from all of the problems, but given how incredibly complex game development is, it's no surprise that it happens as often as it does. Even with games that I haven't heard of. That's not true. I have heard of Artonalico, although I'm not too sure where, and I'm not just talking about the dozens of people who recommended I talk about it on Twitter. I'm also not so sure that I'm pronouncing it correctly, but luckily I don't need to, and all we need to listen to is some awesome fucking music. What is it, some Japanese RPG come anime come video game extravaganza with its own deeply detailed lore that comes with its own language? Yeah, that sounds about right. I reckon I can work with that if one of these games is a bit shit but has a soundtrack full of brilliant music tracks. Oh shit, would you look at that? Artonalico Koga, with a Q, I think, is the third and final installment in this quirky little franchise which takes a few risks and changes up some of the role-playing portions of the combat for more of a real-time strategy take on things. Unfortunately, this switch up wasn't done all that well, and so lets the side down that for 3 games in a row has knocked it into the fucking stratosphere with that tasty music. Any music tracks that read like flip_Arphage in all caps has to be something special, and the whole soundtrack has this really unique style to it that reflects some of the more dramatic story beats in the game, while also leaning heavily on lyrical singing that uses the franchise's made-up language. And it's beautiful stuff when translated, my favourite being this verse that says that if you've been enjoying this video and want to see more, then make sure to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications for every new video. Artonalico finished at 3 games, but was succeeded by Seal No Surge, not in terms of the immediate storyline, but by being in the same universe. Not sure if this carries over to the music, but we've still got 3 very unique soundtracks to flick through. Just wish more games made music like this. It's kinda crazy how inconsistent Sonic games are. Given the talent and money that goes into these games, it's kinda wild that there's been so many genuinely terrible Sonic games in the past, because you'd have to assume that at least some good can come from these games. To be fair, despite numerous shaky entries in a short space of time, there aren't too many games in there that are virtually irredeemable all the way through. A fact that is made all the more evident if you stop trying to play these games and just listen to them. Sonic has always aimed to paint its characters as these cooler than possible demigods with bags of charisma and a theme that suits them in all areas in the game down to the ground. Imagine what kind of strange mess of quality you'd end up with if this was the case with Sonic 06. Oh wait, I remember now. Sonic 06 has a reputation for being many things for many people and being enough of a broken mess to be strangely enjoyable in a Stockholm Syndrome kind of way. It can be very hard to determine what is intentional in this game or not, but the one thing you can be sure of is the music, which is thankfully not plagued by the same glitches as the rest of the game. Although, it is very hard for music to be glitchy. If there's one thing that you can be sure of, it will likely have been Sonic 06 making an appearance at some point in this video. The discourse on this game generally boils down to pointing and laughing at glitches and acknowledging the outstanding work done by this group of 5 composers. Yeah, it's not one person filling the soundtrack with gold because Sega wanted to underline how much of a next-gen Sonic game this was and hired a team to produce 2 whole albums of music, often in close collaboration with mainstay bands like Zebrahead and Crush 40. And that's a hell of an idea, since it gives Sonic 06 soundtrack this wonderful blend of styles, with dramatic orchestral pieces lining up alongside catchier rock songs to give you some background music that is vastly overcompensating for all of these distracting glitches. It's a bit of a shame that Sonic 06 is so distracting because you'll often be sitting there, mouth agape at whatever crap this game has decided to throw your way, simply unable to do anything as advanced as listening to music. That's what Sonic 06 does, it strips you of your senses and leaves you an uncultured mess of a human being. No amount of Solaris phase anything can help with that. It has to be weird being the composer for a terrible video game. It's like being the only capable one on a group project where everyone else is slacking off and screwing around. The proverbial bridge made out of dowel rods, barely held together with loose scraps of string because of the effort of one person or a group of individuals who actually care about the final product. I'd love to know how these composers feel when they see the end result, because it can't feel all that great when your music is attached to such a crappy video game. This must be the life of Tim Follin, who has an impressively large library of credits, primarily from the 80s and 90s, with one key similarity amongst those games: they're just not all that great. Again, you can make allowances for games from this period not being all that great because developers were still testing the water to see what functional game design looks like, and no one had written those books yet. But clearly this didn't stop Tim Follin from filling his repertoire with an impressive list of soundtracks for games that honestly did not deserve them in the slightest. You know Silver Surfer, the unplayably difficult NES game that has one of the best soundtracks in the entire NES library? Yeah, that's Tim Follin, and probably a good enough contender on its own to top this video, but he's also put his name to games like Equinox and its beautiful ambient soundtrack, coupled with shoddy gameplay plagued with awful hit detection, and Plock, which suffers from a horribly zoomed in camera but is home to some high energy themes all the way through the game. Tim Follin even scored a Pictionary game, which is fine, I guess, at least it's semi-functional, but it has a main theme that sounds like it should be in something like Battletoads. I'm not sure how exactly you would score a Pictionary game, but not with something that makes you want to save the world from impending doom. Listen, I'm just guessing what this picture is, calm the fuck down. This RabbidLuigi and Tim Follin's work becomes even more amazing when you realise how difficult it was to make music for games on older consoles. Even with limited hardware and software, Follin managed to get more instruments into the music by replacing one of the sound effect channels, and he just continued to do whatever he could to get the most out of what he had to play with. But damn! Did he have to be so extra all the time? I feel inadequate just listening to this.
Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below, because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.